Okay, so picture this with me. It's April 1912. The largest ship ever built, outfitted with the latest tech, is about to set sail. It's packed with anticipation, dreams. It's a scene we've all imagined, haven't we? But today, on this deep dive, we're going beyond that familiar Titanic story. We're going to uncover the human lives caught up in its fate.
You're totally right. It's easy to get lost in just how massive the disaster was. But what we forget is that the Titanic, it wasn't just a ship. It was like a little society, all packed together.
Exactly. And to guide this deep dive, we've got Hugh Brewster's Titanic as our source. What makes Brewster's work so powerful is how he uses first-hand accounts. We're talking letters, diary entries, real unfiltered peeks into what those passengers were thinking and feeling. Get ready to experience this iconic event in a completely different way through the personal stories woven into its tragic end.
It's kind of amazing. These primary sources make history feel so human, don't you think? Suddenly, they're not just names on a passenger list. They're people with hopes and dreams and connections that go way beyond the deck of the Titanic.
It's like that 6 degrees of separation game, but on a ship sailing straight towards its destiny, ready to unpack some of these intertwined fates.
Absolutely. Let's jump in.
All right, so picture this. Frank Millet, a really famous American artist, is on his way back to America after years in England. And who's he traveling with? Archie Butt, President Taft's own military aide.
Major Butt, they called him, was a fascinating guy in his own right, kept meticulous diaries. They're a gold mine for understanding those last days on board.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. Brewster, he reveals that Millet actually knew Stanford White, the acclaimed architect who designed Madison Square Garden in New York.
And Stanford White's story adds a whole other layer, right? I mean, his murder, a whole scandal involving love triangles and society's rules back then, it was still fresh in everyone's minds in 1912.
It reminds us that even with all the opulence and luxury on the Titanic, those whispers of scandal and society changing, it was always there right beneath the surface.
Exactly. You see, the Titanic sinking, it didn't happen out of nowhere. It was a time of huge societal shifts. Like, they were right on the edge of the modern world, and then...
And speaking of society's whirlwinds,
Yeah.
just imagine being Lady Duff Gordon, a fashion icon, sailing under a fake name. Can you imagine?
Lucille, that's what she went by professionally. She designed clothes for the highest levels of society, even dressed some of the women who would later criticize what she did during the sinking. Talk about irony, huh?
The whispers in those high society circles could be just as brutal as the Atlantic, huh?
You got it. And the Duff Gordon story. Well, as we'll see, it shows just how much class and those social ladders played into all the stories that came out after the Titanic. But before we get into all that, let's shift gears to a group of friends who really drive home the human cost of this tragedy.
You're talking about the Three Musketeers, that group of friends from Winnipeg, Canada, heading home after a big European adventure.
Yeah, them. And Brewster, he shares this really poignant detail, a letter from one of them, Beatty, written just a few days before the sinking. He mentions the Titanic being unsinkable, just casually, like it was nothing.
Chills, right. It just shows you how much faith people had in technology back then. It was an era obsessed with progress. And the Titanic, in so many ways, it represented that boundless ambition. It's one thing to talk about the social scene on the Titanic, all those connections, but what about those last few hours? The chaos, the fear.
Brewster takes us right into the thick of it, doesn't he?
He really does. That's what makes him such a good historian, I think. He can take these big historical forces and weave them in with these really personal stories, survival, courage, and, yeah, the loss, too.
And he never lets you forget that it's about people, right? Like, take Molly Brown, unsinkable Molly Brown. Most people just picture the caricature.
Right, right.
But Brewster gives you this much more complex, nuanced picture of Margaret Brown, the real person. He shows how ahead of her time she was. I mean, this is a woman who was already fighting for social reform, for women's right to vote.
And when the Titanic was sinking, she was anything but a helpless passenger. Brewster describes her as a force of nature, literally pushing women and children into lifeboats, even challenging the crew when she thought they were moving too slow.
It's amazing. And even in all that panic and terror, you still see these flickers of real compassion. Brewster tells this story about 2 little French boys who lost their dad during the evacuation.
Oh, that one gets me every time. Just heartbreaking.
Totally. But here's the thing. Another passenger, she sees what's happening and takes them under her wing, makes sure they're safe through the whole thing. Just goes to show you, the human spirit is incredible, even in the worst situations.
Speaking of finding light in the darkness, you can't forget about the music, the band, playing on as the ship went down.
Yeah. That image really sticks with you. To this day, people still argue about what the last song they played was, but what everyone agrees on is the impact that music had. In that moment, facing death, it must have been something else.
A powerful symbol, right? Proof that even with all that tragedy, art, and beauty, they can still give you strength.
Absolutely. And while some found comfort in the music, others, they clung to hope, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Brewster talks about Jacques Futrelle, a pretty famous writer back then, who was convinced he could swim to safety.
It's hard to wrap your head around, how could anyone prepare for something like that?
I know, right? It just shows you the sheer power of that moment. It's why these firsthand accounts are so important. They don't just give you the facts. They help you understand on a gut level what it felt like to go through something unimaginable.
It's amazing how Brewster takes us past the sinking itself. We see how the Titanic, how it kept affecting the people who survived. It wasn't just like making it out of the water. The whole world was watching, judging.
Exactly. We're talking about a global news story,
Right.
And the media, it was just getting big and powerful back then. So everyone's watching the survivors, especially the big names we've talked about, and their stories become this whole debate. Class, responsibility, even technology's role, it all gets tangled up in the Titanic.
Right, like with Lady Duff Gordon, the fashion designer. Her story, after the rescue, it's crazy.
Yeah, remember how she boarded the Titanic using a fake name? Well, after the disaster, everyone knew who she was. She and her husband, Sir Cosmo, they were public enemy #1, basically.
Because of their lifeboat.
Exactly. People were saying Sir Cosmo paid the crew to row away faster, that they left people behind in the water.
Wow. It really shows you how big that gap between the classes was back then.
It sure does. The public, especially those who lost people they loved, they couldn't imagine. A rich couple putting themselves first. People were furious.
Yeah, Brewster, he also introduces us to people like Renee Harris. Her story, it reminds you that even with all the tragedy, there's still amazing resilience.
Hers is really something. Renee, she lost everything when the Titanic went down. Her husband, he was a big-time theater producer, and he didn't make it.
Losing your partner like that, I can't even imagine.
It's so awful. But she rebuilt her life. And get this, she became a success on Broadway. In the theater world, which back then, it was all men. It says a lot about her, her strength.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Beyond the headlines, beyond the sinking.
Yeah.
How did this one event, the Titanic, how did it shape the lives of the people who carried that memory with them?
It stays with you, doesn't it, that question? And Brewster, he doesn't give you any easy answers. He wants you to think about it. About fate, about the choices people make, about how strong the human spirit really is.
Oh, and he includes this fascinating bit from Woodrow Wilson's inauguration speech. This is the same year, 1912, just a few months after the Titanic. Wilson, he talks about change, about how we need to go back to simpler values.
Isn't that interesting? It's almost like the Titanic sinking, the symbol of like unstoppable technology and ambition. It was a warning, like be careful with progress. Don't forget to think about what you're doing.
It really makes you wonder, what if we could go back, listen in on the conversations people were having after the Titanic? How did this event and all the stories we've talked about today, how did they shape the world? Because, things were about to change forever with the World War coming. Something to think about.
It is. Remember, history, it's not just dates and events in a book. It's about people. It's about resilience, about loss, and about how our lives, they're all connected in ways we don't even realize.
And if you're as hooked on these stories as we are, do yourself a favor. Read Hugh Brewster's Titanic. It's historical storytelling at its best. He shows you how just one person's story can change the way you see even the biggest events. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never forget how powerful a single story can be.